Good morning and welcome to Redeemer. I'm Pastor Gary Lodeholt. I tried my best to avoid it. A few years ago, I had to make an overnight trip to Gettysburg, Pennsylvania because of a responsibility I had for the Synod. I'd never been to Gettysburg before, and although the schedule would be tight, I did at least hope for an opportunity to stand up on Seminary Ridge and look over the battlefield. The two of us from here arrived at Gettysburg after dark, so I couldn't see anything then, but I was surprised to find that our hotel was on the site of Robert E. Lee's headquarters. That was kind of neat to see. The next morning I went outside with anticipation, only to find that a heavy fog had descended on Gettysburg, and I couldn't see anything at all. We went over to the seminary for our interview, and when that finished, we had about an hour before we had to head to the airport for our flight home. So I figured the best we could do was at least drive over to the battlefield for a glimpse. That's when I learned that my companion had actually attended Gettysburg College and was a history major. Friends, if you've only got an hour to see Gettysburg, to already have in the car a history major who spent 4 years there is a pretty good way to do it. We rode through the battlefield in our rented PT Cruiser, looking at the various memorials and fields, and I listened intently as my friend described the events that had happened here or there. We stopped on top of Little Round Top and looked over the site. It wasn't hard to imagine hearing the reports of the rifles and cannon, or to picture maimed flesh and bloody bodies littering the field. I was glad to see the place, even for just a few minutes, where such an historical event took place. And then we began the trip home. Our flights took us through Dulles Airport in D.C., and as we boarded that plane to come to Columbia, I found my seat next to a woman. I greeted her, and as things developed, we started chatting just a bit. And I was already cringing inside because I knew where this would go. As we talked about why she was coming to Columbia, which was for work, I was doing everything I could to avoid the conversation. You see, the way this conversation was heading was that I was going to have to ask her what kind of work she did. The problem with that is that once I asked her, she was going to ask me. And when people ask me and find out what I do, it changes things. The conversation changes. The topics and behaviors are different. I just wanted to read my book, but I ended up asking her, and of course she ended up asking me. "Oh," she said, "my grandfather and great-grandfather and great-great-grandfather were Methodist ministers." Maybe this won't be so bad, I thought to myself. She went on, "And I've been to the Episcopal Church." That's even better, I thought, although I realized she didn't say she was a member or that she went regularly, and little warning bells went off somewhere. Then she said, "You know, that whole body and blood thing, that's just so outdated. We should update the metaphor." I just wanted to read my book, and there I was. I tried to explain that for me it was not just a metaphor, but something much deeper. I tried to explain the idea of the real presence of Jesus in the bread and wine, and that it wasn't just an historical event, but that it had real and lasting significance for today, that every time we remember by doing it, it's new all over again. It's real all over again. Thankfully, she didn't want to talk religion all the way to Columbia any more than I did, and so after a while we drifted to our own pursuits. But somewhere over North Carolina, I guess, I began to think of how the day had begun. Earlier, I had imagined a field full of bodies and blood, but it was locked in history. And my day ended by talking about body and blood that transcends history and is a real presence in my life. We've talked about Holy Communion this week, and we've talked about food and family and forgiveness, all of them part of this special meal. But to me, today's word that starts with F is the very heart of what communion is all about. Our word is faith. And I use that word to talk about Jesus really present in that bread and wine. We use the word faith to talk about it because it's not something we see. It's not even something we really fully understand. When Luther talks about it, he uses all sorts of prepositions. Jesus is with, under, above, and through the bread and wine. Somehow, when we eat the bread and drink the wine, Jesus comes into our lives in a real and powerful way. As we gather around his table, he's there, right there with us. And somehow as we leave, he goes with us, and we are strengthened and renewed for lives of faith. Jesus is not an outdated metaphor. He's alive and he's here. We taste him in the bread. We receive him through the wine. We see him with the eyes of faith. The word communion means union with. And that's exactly what we have. That's exactly what we give thanks for. In this meal, we are one with each other. In this meal, we are one in our need for God's mercy and forgiveness. In this meal, we are one with Jesus himself. Do this in remembrance of me, he said. And as we do, we know that he remembers us in his love. We call it the Lord's Supper, but it's really for us. It's really about what Jesus does for us. In love, in grace, he gives us himself. Come, taste and see. Thanks for watching, and remember to let this day belong to God.